Hey peeps, today I'm talking all things piping. Sewing piping into a seam with gathered fabric is totally possible. Something you want to think about is the placement of that. For example, I've got it in the bodice and the skirt of this dress. For the bodice, I have decided to fully line this bodice so that I don't have to worry about bulky seam finishes. You are adding extra layers of fabric when you add it to your project, so it is something to bear in mind. I personally prefer a fully lined bodice on all of my garments. It's just something that I really like, and I do have a sew along for this specific dress which talks you through adding a full lining so that you don't have to worry about finishing these raw edges on the inside of your garment. Getting a very good idea of how this is going to turn out. I personally like to sew in the singular piece first. It makes sure that I am doing the smallest piece in the first instance, and also that I am getting the correct piece into the correct side of the dress, because the other piece needs to have the front and back sewn together at the side seam to go into the corresponding yoke piece as well. The other thing that I like to do is I like to sew in, especially with pivot points like we've got here, I like to sew in the first straight seam first, backstitching at the beginning and the end, before I go around and sew in the top seam and then the waist seam the whole way around. So the first thing that I'm going to do is draw in the seam allowance on the bodice piece for both the top and the bottom where the pivot points are going to meet, and I'm doing that with a friction pen. And the next thing that I like to do is, let's move this part out of the way. The next thing that I like to do is I want to lay my piece that's going into this piece so that they are in the correct orientation for when it's finished, because you actually have to sew this piece to this piece with all of the bodice going in the wrong direction or looking like it's going in the wrong direction. So if I line it up how it's going to end up first, that way I just make sure that I'm not sewing it in upside down or incorrectly. I've marked in my pieces, I've aligned everything correctly, so I'm going to match up my pivot points. I want to be sewing with the yoke side up, which has got the piping attached to it already. So I'm just poking my needle through the corner, and I'm going to line it up carefully with the seam allowance that I've marked onto the bodice piece, matching up the raw edges of the straight edge that we're sewing. Get that pinned into place, and then this one I'm going to do the same thing. Find my pivot point, which is there, making sure that I've not gone through the piping when I have pinned this into place, and find my pivot point on my bodice piece. You can mark this on the right side of the fabric just to make this a little bit easier, but if you do that, you want to make sure that whatever marking tool that you are using will come away and not leave any residue. The friction pens can sometimes leave a white mark on the fabric when you iron over it, depending on the fabric that you're using. So I tend to prefer to mark my corner points on the wrong side of the fabric and just kind of aim at the cross mark. So I'm pinning up the rest of this piece, and I haven't clipped into my corner at the top here yet because I don't need to. So I have my bodice pinned to my yoke pieces, and I have a line of stitching to follow, which is where we sewed the piping to the yoke pieces earlier. I'm going to backstitch at the pivot points at the beginning and the end to secure everything into place, and that's the first piece of stitching that I'm going to do. If you don't get right up against the piping, or you kind of deviate from the stitching that you've done earlier, that's not the end of the world. As long as it doesn't create any tucks or puckers, you can go back over the little parts later if you have kind of wavered away from the piping, but you want to get as close to the piping as you possibly can to make it look as seamless as possible. So backstitch at the beginning and the end, and keep as close to the piping as you can, and I'm using my zipper foot to do this. Okay, so I have sewn my seam. I am pretty happy with how everything is lying. The next thing that I'm going to do is clip into the corner. If you've watched any of my videos before, you know when there's a pivot point like this, I like to do it in the number of steps of corners that I have to go around. The only difference with doing this with piping in is that you are having to use your zipper foot rather than your regular foot. We have already clipped into the piping, so we don't want to clip into that again. I'm just going to clip up to, but not all the way through, my stitching, which is going to allow me to maneuver the fabric around so that I can go around that corner. Now, this bodice does have some gathering in it. Usually, again, if you've watched any of my sew-alongs, you know that I like to sew with the gathering side under the presser foot and the flat side under the feed dogs, because I feel I have better control over the gathers. And you can still do that with this method, but because I want to make sure that I'm getting as close to the piping as possible, I am actually going to sew with the piping side up first. If anything goes awry underneath, you can always unpick, readjust and sew from the gathering side up for the second pass if you need to. But I, as I say, prefer this with piping involved. I prefer to sew with the piping side up. So I'm going to pin up to where the gathers are meant to come, and I'm going to anchor my gathering thread to my pin. You can, of course, tie a knot in it. I'm using the Isacord thread because it's the closest match that I've got to this, and it's really slippery. This is not my favorite thread to use for anything other than embroidery, but it is the best match for the color of fabric that I'm working with. So I am trying to make it work, and it's already kind of come undone from the pin. So let's properly try and anchor that into place like that. So it's the usual thing that you want to do. Make your gathering thread or gathered piece the correct length. Tease out your gathers so that they are nicely distributed over the area that they need to cover, and pin them into place. If you again have watched any of my tutorials, you know that I like to do 2 lines of gathering stitching, one either side of the final stitching line. I obviously double check to make sure that the fabric doesn't get too damaged by having thread put through it, because I am doing 1 line of gathering stitching in the visible part of the garment, but I find that this gives the neatest gathers and also allows this method to work quite well because the gathers tend to behave themselves a little better when you're sewing them into place. I'll get that final bit in, just stroke those gathers through a little bit more. Okay, I've got all my pins in place. I need to be careful when I start my stitching that I'm not going through the cording of the piping, that I'm starting at the very corner, and this is why I like to do it from this side so I can see where the previous line of stitching is. And as I say, if the worst comes to the worst and the gathering on the other side does get unruly, you can always unpick and readjust and resew after the fact. But for this very first line of stitching, I do like to sew with the yoke side up. So I am going to get that done, and we'll have a look and see how the gathers behave. That all went in very nicely that side, and thankfully the gathers all behaved themselves very nicely on the other side as well. Like I say, I sew my gathering stitches 3/8 of an inch away from the wrong edge and then 3/8 of an inch away from that, so into the actual visible part of the garment, as you can see here. This fabric recovers very well from being sewn through. You do want to do a test swatch beforehand if you do want to do this method. So I'm going to take my gathering stitches out. My corner is very corner-like, and when I check it on the other side with a good press, that's going to look great. So I'm going to do the same thing for the other side. Now down here I've got the front midriff and the back midriff to do. So the thing that I'm going to pin into place first is the side seam to the side seam to make sure that they're in place. Then I'll pin this other edge and then I will pull the gathers. Something else that I do like to do, especially with a long gathering section like this, is to mark in the center of the back piece and the center of the midriff so that I can make sure that I've got the gathers evenly spaced to either side of the center point of whatever I'm gathering into. When it's a smaller piece like this, it's not quite so important, but along the back you want to make sure that your gathers are nice and even along the whole way. And again, it's the same thing. We're going to be sewing with the yoke side underneath the zipper foot so we can see the stitching line where the piping was attached, and then readjusting the gathering after that first line of stitching if it needs readjusting. So I'm going to get that done for this final seam for the bottom, and then I will need to do the same thing to sew the top of the back section to the yoke. I'm going to get that all done and I'll show you what that looks like when we are done. Your best friend when you're sewing is your zipper foot. As long as you make sure that you have a visible guide for your stitching and you've got your zipper foot on, this actually is a fairly easy technique to do. And take it in stages like I'm doing. Back stitch at the beginning and the end. Take the work out from under the presser foot when you need to maneuver around difficult corners. Corners with piping can look very pretty and effective and don't need to be a complete nightmare to sew. I have got that long line of stitching done and I'm really happy with how the gathers turned out on the back, but on the front there is a piece here where I've got the fabric's kind of like gone over itself and I don't like how that looks. It's kind of turned into a pleat rather than a gather. So I am going to unpick this little bit and rearrange that little bit of fabric, and it is literally just that little bit of fabric and I am being finicky about it. And I'm going to re-sew that from this side because I have got the majority of it sewn so that the piping is well ensconced. Just want to rejig this tiny little bit here because I don't like that pleat. This is what I mean, like as long as you're sewing it from this side first, you can always readjust this side afterwards. You can even, if you would like to, sew this side with a longer basting stitch so it's easier to unpick if you wanted to, but I've just sewn it with a regular stitch, as I say, and I'm just gonna rejig this tiny little bit here. I have one large video of all of the mini tutorials back to back, so hopefully I have covered what you're looking for in that. I will link to the playlist and all of the individual videos in the description down below. But if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section down below and I'll do my best to answer them for you. If you've enjoyed this video, you might want to check out this one here.